Hello, everyone, and welcome. Dr. Miles here today with Dr. Ashlie Bell. I'm looking forward to this interview because I've had the honor of knowing Dr. Bell for a while here, and she is the owner and director of NeuroGrove. She is an internationally renowned brain health expert and a respected leader in the fields of neurotherapy and integrative mental health. And I've known Dr. Bell through her work in looking at some research around PTSD. She's completed her doctoral degree at the College of Integrative Medicine in Health Sciences at Saybrook University. She received high honors for the dissertation and distinction award. She's a licensed clinical social worker. She's a public speaker. She's a researcher, and she is also a published author. She's had the honor of studying with some of the most respected experts in the fields of neurofeedback, as well as neurostimulation and biofeedback and integrative mental health. And Dr. Bell's had her own journey of healing from multiple concussions and 9 years of systemic illness. And she's developed a strong passion for integrative brain body wellness. She now works in the fields of health and mental health and has for over 14 years and is well known for her specialized knowledge in brain-based assessments and interventions, as well as integrative mental health and the treatment of trauma-related challenges. So we really wanted to bring Dr. Ashlie Bell on this summit because we know there's so many associations between Lyme disease, mold illness, and neurological dysfunction, mental health issues. There's a big overlap. There are a lot of causes that we've discussed in some of the other talks on this summit that we've interviewed some people about, the various causes of autoimmune neuropsychiatric syndrome. We've talked with people about neurological rewiring. So we really want to give multiple perspectives on how do you work with some of the neurological symptoms related to Lyme disease and mold illness. So I'm really enthusiastic about this talk called Calm Your Brain to Heal Your Body with Dr. Ashlie Bell. Welcome, Ashlie.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I think it's amazing what you have put together with the summit. And I'm just hopeful that what I have to share today can be really helpful for people's healing journeys and giving them some of what they need to move forward in their illness. So yeah, very excited.
Wonderful. Well, go ahead and share your presentation and let's get going with the talk here.
Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, so like Dr. Miles said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how our brain interacts with our bodies and how we can actually utilize that to help our bodies heal. So I'm going to be providing a lot of education around the intricate links between the two and also how imbalances in our brains can actually interfere with our body's healing processes. So I'll be talking about that. I'll also be talking about how chronic stress and excessive stress, whether that's physical or emotional, can contribute to these imbalances. And then we'll be talking about inflammatory cycles and how those can be triggered between the brain and the immune system, which can create some feedback loops that can sometimes lead to some harm. So we'll talk about the inflammatory cycles. And then, of course, we're going to be talking about what to do about it. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel. There is hope for healing. And sometimes we just need to give our brains and our bodies a little help to get them to that next stage in the healing process. So I'll be discussing a bunch of different methods that we can use for that, primarily focusing on neurotherapy. So there's different types of neurotherapy we'll talk about, like neurofeedback, transcranial neurostimulation, there's pulsed electromagnetic fields. And so these different types of neurotherapy can help on the brain side of things. And then we'll talk about a few other things that you can do to help your brain and body heal, ranging from nutritional tips to biofeedback to somatic and mindfulness-based interventions. So we'll just kind of go over all these different things that you can do to really help your brain enter this more calm state and help your body heal.
That's wonderful. We need so many tools in especially the world of Lyme disease, mold illness, as many tools as possible to be able to work with the nervous system, the brain-body connection, excessive stress, inflammatory cycles from as many perspectives as possible. And I think some of these will be new to some of our audience. So I'm looking forward.
For sure. Yeah, well, and mold and Lyme in particular, they just affect so many different systems. You know, it really does have these trickle-down effects. And so we need to take that whole person approach, address it from as many angles as possible to really get past that barrier that we have to healing. So, yeah. Okay, so we'll jump in. First and foremost, I'd like to talk about the brain-body connection. So the brain-body connection, of course, is something that seems like a given. It seems pretty obvious that our brain is connected to our body. And yet, for some reason, I think a lot of our medical field tends to forget that. So we treat the two as if they were separate. And I think it's important to realize just how interconnected they are and how they're constantly working behind the scenes to help all of these bodily processes take place, to help us cognitively process things. You know, they're working together without us even being consciously aware of it. You know, I mean, just as I'm speaking with you right now, my brain is having to tell the muscles in my face and my tongue to form the sounds that are coming out of my mouth. You know, they're talking with my heart to cause it to keep beating and getting that blood flow to my brain. And it's also telling it to increase and decrease because, you know, if heart rate gets too fast, then our blood vessels could burst, which is not great. So the brain is sending signals down to the heart, telling it, okay, speed up. And then the heart's sending a signal back to the brain saying, okay, we're a little full. We need to slow down. And then the brain sends it back and round they go. So all of this is happening behind the scenes without us even realizing it. And it's happening simultaneously. You know, the brain is incredibly complex. It can also be managing our digestive processes. You know, it's right now digesting the food I ate an hour ago, you know, and it's fine-tuning my immune system. It's doing all of this without my awareness. So the brain is essentially like the CEO of this incredibly complex system that we call a body. And it's the primary command center. So it keeps all the other processes going smoothly. But unfortunately, if things get out of balance, especially if the brain gets out of balance, then it can really bring down a lot of systems with it. So that's why we're focusing in on the brain first and foremost. So looking at the brain and the nervous system, that's the first connection I'd like to go into. And these two, of course, are intricately interconnected. You know, there actually is no disconnection between the two whatsoever. So the way I see it, the brain basically just extends from the top of our head down to the tips of our fingers and our toes. It's all one system. And we've got afferent and efferent pathways. So the afferent pathways are bringing signals up from the body to the brain, where the stimuli is then integrated, it's processed. And so these signals are first received by the parts of the brain stem, parts like the locus coeruleus, and then it moves up to some of these subcortical regions like the thalamus and the amygdala, and then those signals continue up to the cortex where they're really integrated and processed. And then the cortex interprets that data, it coordinates a response, and then it sends signals back down to the subcortical regions, to the brainstem, and down into the body to start to regulate these bodily processes. And it can send those signals down through nerve impulses as well as things like hormones and neurotransmitters. So this is how the brain is helping regulate these different systems and having such a significant impact on our healing process.
Yeah, this point is so important. One of my favorite studies that illustrates that point is one where they took mice and half of them got a probiotic feed, the other half got a broth. And they subjected both groups to a stress test. They put them in water. They had to swim. It's stressful. They were trying to get out. And the ones with the broth that did not get the probiotic, after 4 minutes, they kind of gave up. They had a lot of corticosteroid release, which is like the cortisol stress hormone for mice, and they just burned themselves out. But the ones that had a probiotic, they found had a lot of GABA release in the brain, this neurotransmitter. It's involved in relaxation, and it offset their stress response. So they get a stress response, but then they get some GABA and a stress response in GABA, and then they went a step further to prove that this was indeed the probiotic that was in the gut that was sending signals to the brain. They severed the vagal nerve in these mice so that that signal would no longer go from the gut to the brain. And those mice that had that better stress response, had the GABA release, went right back to the lesser stress response. They gave up after 4 minutes. They didn't have the GABA release anymore. So clearly there's very direct evidence in the research that things like the gut bacteria can send signals via the vagus nerve to the brain, and there can be neurotransmitter responses like GABA release that can mitigate a stress response. So really important point, and lots of research to back that up.
Yeah, that's actually one of my other favorite topics, is that gut-brain connection, because there's so many crazy studies on that, like you're talking about with that rodent study. One of my favorite rodent studies on the gut-brain connection is they actually took two groups of mice. There was one group of mice that were just naturally very anxious, and they were, very timid. They weren't very exploratory. And then there was another group of mice that was really adventurous and just got out there. They weren't really that anxious. And they actually took the gut bacteria from each group and they switched it. And they put the gut bacteria from the anxious mice into the adventurous mice. They took the gut bacteria from the adventurous mice, put it in the anxious mice. And next thing you knew, the anxious mice were more adventurous. The adventurous mice were more timid. So I think these, gut bacteria actually play a pretty significant role in our mental health and our brain function. There's actually studies that also show that the gut bacteria play a role in the development of our hypothalamus, which is the main stress trigger center in our brain. So yeah, I'll be briefly touching on the gut brain in this presentation. I focus a little more in on the immune system here, but that is a fascinating topic. And as we know, it's all interconnected, all affecting the others. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, both directions, gut to brain, brain to gut, heart to brain, brain to heart. It's a bidirectional system, signals going back and forth all the time.
For sure. And that's actually one of my passions, is just realizing how we have all these different interconnections in the brain and the body. Let's take a look at how stress plays a role in all of this. So, we tend to think of stress as, oh yeah, I deal with stress on a daily basis, right? And we almost just accept it as this is life. We're going to be dealing with stress. However, it's really important that we realize how much this stress is doing to us, especially when it starts to become chronic or excessive. So with all these feedback loops that we have between the brain and all the systems in our body, we need to keep them all working together for the good. And when we have things like chronic or excessive stress, it can actually cause them to work together in almost this downward spiral where one is negatively impacting the others. And stress can be that catalyst, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about how that has an impact here and then what we can do about it. So when we see chronic or excessive stress, we tend to see certain regions of the brain that get hypersensitized, or they almost get stuck on. And they're usually regions that are related to the fight or flight responses, such as the amygdala and the hypothalamus. So these regions, when they get stuck on, they don't tend to distinguish as much between what is truly a threat and what is maybe ambivalent stimuli. So I consider like our amygdala kind of like a watchdog, and it tends to be interpreting if something is threatening or not. But when it gets hypersensitized, it's just crying wolf all the time. And it's barking, barking, barking at everybody that goes by, right? So when that happens, then it keeps our HPA axis on as well. And that can cause this release of stress hormones to just be constantly circulating throughout our brains and our bodies. So you may have heard of the hormone cortisol. That's the one that tends to get the most attention. But excess amounts of cortisol actually become toxic. And they are toxic to parts of our brain, especially the ones that contain more receptors for cortisol, like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. So those regions, when they're getting flooded with cortisol, it can actually damage the neurons and impair their functioning. And those two regions in particular are really important for a lot of our cognitive processes. You know, the prefrontal cortex is involved in a lot of our higher level, like executive functions. So things like planning, decision-making, focus, attention, motivation. And it also regulates our emotions. So if that's not functioning properly, it can also allow these fight or flight centers to even run more all over the place. So that's the prefrontal. The hippocampus is also important for learning and memory. One of the interesting things that we're finding in the neuroscience literature is that a lot of what we consider cognitive decline related to age, so age-related cognitive decline, we're actually finding is not so much age that's causing the memory issues as much as stress over time. So when we're exposed to this chronic stress year after year, then that excess cortisol can actually damage those memory regions and lead to those memory issues as we get older. So it's very interesting, and another reason that we need to find ways to really keep this in check.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, stress is really like this fuel on the fire of whatever else is going on. Someone already has exposure to mold, and that toxin is accumulating in the brain or the body, that stress adds a dimension of exponential increase in the immune system dysregulation, the inflammatory effects, the cognitive effects can all accelerate and become a bigger problem. Or if there's a chronic infection like Lyme disease, then it's almost like the inflammation that can happen in the nervous system or the autoimmune response against the dopamine receptors in the brain that can happen can create a hyper susceptibility to stress, in the sense that one person might not create stress hormones if they have a bad day, but another person, if their resilience or their tolerance for stress is much less because of, let's say, a chronic infection has damaged part of the dopamine system or part of their brain's ability, or inflamed their nervous system in a way that they can't handle even that small level of stress, then what happens is there's this dramatically increased amount of cortisol or epinephrine, like adrenaline type hormone, that can then have these negative impacts. And some people will go into this chronic stress where even those hormones can become chronically low as well, like cortisol can become chronically low. And then that can lead to its own set of issues, with fatigue and chronic fatigue being big ones that we see with that. And cortisol has its own anti-inflammatory effects as well as inflammatory effects. So it has a big role in inflammation in the body, a big role in the immune system function. So I think it's really important that people pay close attention to the nervous system as well as the stress hormones and how those impact everything else. Every other condition that a person might have can be dramatically worsened if the stress response is dysregulated. So really important points here.
Yeah, and you make some very important points as well. And that cortisol, like you say, it can be inflammatory, it can be anti-inflammatory, it can energize us, but it can also create anxiety if it's too much. So, it's just another area where it's all about balance. And, if we're flooding our system with cortisol, we're much more likely to then get depleted of it later, which then has its own consequences where now we're not regulating inflammation. And like you say, we're just chronically fatigued. So we want enough of it. It's not that cortisol is bad. We just want it to be in balance. So there's things that we can do to keep that balance. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Great points.
Great. Okay. So zooming in again, if we're looking at some of those effects on the gastrointestinal system, like you were mentioning, Dr. Miles, we do see that stress has a significant effect on that gut. So there is that two-way street where the excess stress hormones are actually altering our microbiome. It can then cause damage to our intestinal barrier because the microbiota are actually helping maintain that. And when we have damage to that intestinal barrier, it can allow certain things like food particles, bacteria, toxins, pathogens, they can cross into the bloodstream without being fully processed. And then they can cause the release of these inflammatory cytokines. Now, one of the interesting things is when you release all these inflammatory cytokines, it can actually increase the rate of shedding in that gut lining. Our gut lining is constantly replacing those cells, trying to keep itself fresh, but it's basically just a bunch of cells pressed together. So if you speed that up too fast, it can't fill in the gaps in time. And so that can cause more things to leak into the bloodstream, cause further inflammation, and then all of that loops back around, sends these signals up to the brain saying, hey, there's a problem. The brain triggers that stress response again, and the cycle continues.
And another point on this is, in addition to there being inflammation, there's also endotoxin when this gut barrier is disrupted. The bacteria, the dead bacteria in the gut, there's so many bacteria in the gut that when the intestine becomes inflamed and those tight junctions become looser, then some of that bacteria makes it into the bloodstream. They actually have an experiment where they inject dead E. coli bacteria into a person's bloodstream to induce an endotoxin response that makes them sick and feel unwell. And so we also get increased toxic burden and increased burden on the liver when this response happens in the gut.
Mm-hmm. Yep, all connected. Okay, so focusing in now on the immune system, like we already started to touch on, we do see a difference between acute stress and chronic stress. So what the research is showing is that under acute stress, just a momentary stress, we tend to see that the immune system is actually enhanced, at least in certain ways. And so it mobilizes the cells to really help the body prepare to fight these injuries or infections. As part of that, like we said, it's going to be releasing those inflammatory cytokines, which are going to help us to eliminate those pathogens, help us to heal in the short term, right? Again, like I mentioned, it's mostly focused on healing wounds as opposed to maintenance processes like clearing out toxins. But it is a beneficial response usually in the short term. However, when the stress gets prolonged, when it gets chronic, then we see that it actually has the opposite. It's dampening the function of a lot of our immune cells. It can actually make us more susceptible to infections, especially things like bacteria and viruses. And it can just impair how we're healing. So that prolonged activation of the microglia, of the cytokines, it can cause a lot of issues. We also see that it can lead to things like oxidative damage. It can cause free radical damage. And because the microglia are playing a role in apoptosis, so it can contribute to that cell death. And we often see this systemic tissue degeneration. Okay. So I'm going to be zooming in now on the inflammation, talking a little more about how these processes work. The key thing about inflammation is realizing that this is kind of like a fire state. Okay, so it actually comes from the Latin root inflammare, which literally means to set on fire. Okay, so it's our body's natural immune response to injury. And like I was saying before, it's beneficial when we actually have these injuries that we need to heal. It's beneficial for countering a lot of pathogens and invaders in our immune system. So this is part of where we see, like, if we get an injury on our skin and it becomes hot and red and swollen and painful, that's inflammation, but it's really designed to clean things out and to help promote those healing processes and prevent infection. So the other important thing I like to point out is that inflammation is not bad in and of itself. It's actually effective and an important natural response that our body utilizes to heal our injuries. When it becomes chronic, however, that's when we have issues, because it's kind of like having this mild fire just constantly burning inside of us, like Dr. Miles was saying. So it's basically going to kill our cells over time. It harms our neurons. It can impact our brains. Chronic inflammation has been associated with a wide array of illnesses. So things like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, depression, anxiety, as well as chronic pain, arthritis, headaches, migraines, GI disorders, heart disease, you name it. Inflammation has probably played a role at some point in that process. So it's a very important thing to look at when we're trying to heal. And of course, as you've probably experienced, mold-related illnesses and Lyme-related symptoms are going to involve a lot of those inflammatory processes.
Yeah, in fact, mold illness is often referred to as chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CIRS, as one of the terms that mold is the root, but what's causing the symptoms is that chronic inflammatory response, which results from the toxin accumulation in the body is sort of part of that initiator of why the chronic inflammation persists throughout time and doesn't resolve, but that it is largely that chronic inflammatory process that is leading to joint pain, neurological decline, leading to the multitude of symptoms related to fatigue and nervous system dysfunction. So inflammation is absolutely all tied up in with the symptom expressions for mold illness, for Lyme, in a big, big way.
For sure. Yeah. I think that's also why mold and Lyme can, first of all, be so difficult to treat, but also difficult to diagnose. And a lot of times they get thrown all these different diagnoses on them. There's like all these different systems that get out of balance. And really, you got to get to the root of it. And they have a common root, but it can manifest in so many different ways. So it makes things very challenging. Okay, so looking at some of the causes and contributors to the inflammation, we do see that, of course, the infection and pathogens are playing a role. And like we're talking about, Lyme and mold, of course, are some of these contributors to inflammatory processes. We also tend to see inflammation with toxic overload. I think that we are exposed to way more toxins than we realize, just in the air, in the water we're drinking, in the foods we're eating, the skincare products we're using. There's toxins everywhere, and they tend to build up in our system. And one of the things that we don't often realize is that our brain is mostly composed of fat, and toxins tend to get stored in fat. So when we have this toxic overload, we can have all these toxins getting stored in our brains and really impairing those processes. So that's part of what's going to be contributing to inflammation. As we've discussed, certain GI problems like leaky gut can contribute. Substances, especially in excess, things like alcohol, cigarettes. As we've talked about, the emotional stress or stress chemistry, especially when it's chronic or excessive, can contribute to inflammation. We also see that if we have an imbalance between omega-3s and omega-6 fatty acids, that can contribute to inflammation as well. We need an appropriate balance, and oftentimes our American diet does not quite provide that. So pro-inflammatory foods, of course, can contribute. Any allergies or sensitivities, dysregulated hormones, again, it's all connected. Vitamin D deficiencies have even been associated with inflammation. Over-exercising, that's one that when I first learned about this, I was surprised because, of course, we always think of exercise as a good thing and we want to exercise and we're always trying to exercise more. But over-exercise, if you're not following it up with things to reduce inflammation, can actually create an excess of the IL-6, one of those inflammatory cytokines in our system. So it's important to also keep exercise in moderation. And if we are exercising intensively, then we need to take measures to reduce inflammation afterwards. Of course, autoimmunity, hypoxia, poor sleep. There's some studies to show that EMFs are also contributing. And then, of course, any kind of trauma or injury. So brain injuries or injuries in our system can lead to that inflammation. So I just like to point that out because even when you're struggling with things like Lyme or mold, it may not just be that that's causing your inflammation. And these other variables can be contributing to and exacerbating that cycle. And if we can address some of those other pieces, we can help you heal from the mold and Lyme. So I did want to talk a little bit more about the mold illness specifically, what we tend to see. Again, you're probably getting some of this in the rest of the summit, but just to give you a brief overview, we've seen that molds tend to produce these metabolites, the mycotoxins. They tend to shed these antigenic materials, of course, things like spores and extracellular polysaccharides, enzymes, and these in excess can become toxic. They can cause those immune responses. So the mold mycotoxicosis, it's a hard one to say. That one is one of the big ones that we see involving the immune system. And it brings in the lungs, the central and peripheral nervous systems. It creates this generalized inflammatory and irritant response. And then it releases these cytokines from the T cells or the peripheral blood cells. So what we have seen is that different types of mold actually create different immune responses. But oftentimes we're seeing significantly greater levels of cytokines like the IL-8 or IL-1 beta. The certain kinds have been shown to increase the IFNY and the TNFA. We've seen that paralleled with a lot of changes in other cytokines, even less common ones like IL-13, IL-17. Basically, mold can create all sorts of interactions. And so it can be a little bit challenging to figure out which cytokines are we needing to address? How are we addressing this inflammation? And that's where sometimes things like medications can be challenging to address this because it is very specific to the type of mold.
And I think and I think it's important also to broaden. It's talked about as mold illness a lot, but we know now that endotoxins in the environment produce a very similar effect to mycotoxins, and there are bacteria that can environmentally grow in water-damaged buildings that can release more endotoxins than they do mycotoxins. And there's also fungal growths in water damaged buildings that can also produce things that can be toxic to the body. So mold illness has been a term that's been used, and mycotoxins have been the primary focus of research, but it's expanding, and there's lots of different kinds of environmental toxins. And we also know that endotoxin relates to the gut as well and other infections. So we have to categorize and separate and talk about things in a way that people understand, but want to make sure people start to broaden the understanding a bit and go beyond just mold. It's actually many different kinds of toxins, mycotoxins being one, and at the forefront of what people think about and talk about at the moment, but it's a broader discussion than just that.
For sure. And that's also where, it's important to understand that this is a broader topic. There's a lot of different things involved, a lot of different players, and also broaden our intervention where we're kind of simultaneously getting as targeted and specific as we can to the type of mold, and then at the same time being broad enough that we're kind of capturing all the different pieces. So, I'll discuss some of our interventions that we use, but for example, one of the things that we found is that neurostimulation or different frequencies tend to address different cytokines. And so rather than just being like, okay, we're going to only target this cytokine, which a lot of medications I think do, they're just like IL-6, we're targeting that. And really, we want to be able to kind of target everything. So one of our protocols, we actually will use this variety of frequencies, each of which is targeting different cytokines. And over time, if we're doing that enough, then we're kind of hitting all of them at once to try to bring them all into this appropriate balance and capturing it with a broader net, essentially.
Yeah, that's important. We do the same thing in our clinic with binders, usually use multiple binders to capture different kinds of toxins, because there's no way we can test for or even know all of what's present, and some might not be researched yet. And so it's really important to be able to have a little bit of a broader spectrum activity on treatment intervention. So I'm glad you guys are doing that.
For sure. Yeah, you too. Teamwork. Okay. So looking at Lyme now, just pointing out a few things that we've seen in the research. So it does tend to show these much higher levels of the TNF alpha in those with Lyme. Some studies have shown over 7 times the amount in individuals who have Lyme disease. Other studies have shown over 2 times the amount of IL-8. We've shown increases in IL-6 as well, especially being produced by those astrocytes. We've seen a lot of inflammatory mediators in the CNS, and we also tend to see glial and neuronal apoptosis, so that programmed cell death, which again is important for certain processes. We need to be cleaning out cells that are dying and that aren't functioning properly. And at the same time, if we do that too much, we start to really damage the neurons in our brain. Okay, and then the other piece I just wanted to briefly touch on is that brain injury can actually create a lot of these trickle-down effects too. So we've got the chronic stress that we went over, which is the more emotional side of things. But then physical stress can also start a lot of these processes. So we've seen that, with traumatic brain injuries, we have the phase 1, which is the event that actually caused the traumatic brain injury. But then we have phase 2, which is the secondary cascade of inflammation that can happen for even years afterward and can cause this progressive damage to the brain that eventually can present as these different psychological, cognitive, or even physical impairments. So with traumatic brain injury, we do tend to see a diminution of neuroregulators. So these are regulators of things like neurotransmitters, neurosteroids, hormones, all of that. We tend to see the oxidative stress and reactive O2, which can also create further damage to those neurons. We tend to see inflammatory cytokines, again, there they are. And we see a disruption of that blood-brain barrier. So again, this is where now these toxins and these pathogens that were previously in our bloodstream and blocked out by this blood-brain barrier, now that starts to get inside the barrier because our barrier isn't keeping them out appropriately. So now we start to see more and more effects on the brain as those start to enter into the brain and the neurons. So those are the key pieces. You know, we also see over time some deficiencies of neurosteroids like we've talked about, and we can see excitotoxicity where certain parts of the brain actually get overactive. They're just stuck on. So again, that can loop back around, that can create more of those stress responses, and so it goes.
Yeah, I am so surprised in doing intakes with patients how frequently, when we trace back and we look historically at the events that have happened that may have been potential triggers related to the onset of their illness or their chronic inflammatory response or many of their symptoms, I see head injury so much as part of one of those initiators, and many times multiple head injuries. And so I believe that there's this perfect storm that has to happen. First, the body is so resilient. The brain is so resilient. It can take a lot of abuse. It can take a lot of onslaught of poor lifestyle choices, poor dietary choices, chronic stress. But at some point, that perfect storm, often I find that it's either a huge stressful event like the death of a loved one, or a huge change in relationship or job or a divorce, or a head injury being something that pushes over the edge that maybe someone was already predisposed genetically to have a potential issue with mold and environmental toxins, but it was as if that gene wasn't expressing, or at least there weren't an onslaught of symptoms until we had a combination of factors. And sometimes it was head injuries earlier in life and stressors that were chronic earlier in life. And then it was moving into an environment that had a lot of mycotoxin and mold in it that was the trigger. But sometimes it was the person had lived in moldy environments during childhood and throughout their lives, and it wasn't triggering a chronic inflammatory response until later they had a head injury or a big stressful event. And then that kind of pushed, it was the straw that broke the camel's back, pushed them over the edge, created that perfect storm. So it's so important. Again, we broaden out here, and we understand that everyone wants the smoking gun, the one thing that caused everything, but it's generally the one thing was just the straw that broke the camel's back. And there were a lot of other things that had to be set up along the way before a person got into this chronic inflammatory response and started to have all these mental, emotional symptoms, physical symptoms, pain, fatigue. All of these kinds of things started to express because of a perfect storm. And if we limit it to just one thing, often people don't get results. If they just go after Lyme, or if they just go after mold, really you have to look at Lyme, you have to look at mold, you have to look at gut, you have to look at diet, you have to look at stress, brain injuries, many different things in order to be able to put together a comprehensive plan that unwinds sometimes years and years and layers of things before a person even noticed their symptoms. And that unwinding and healing process is a journey. So I'm glad you're bringing up traumatic brain injury. I don't think it gets enough attention or play, but it is one that I see frequently as being one of the players in a person's initiation of their chronic inflammatory responses, or a historic contributor to the perfect storm that led later to them having those responses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's actually something that I think doesn't get brought up enough because it's undiagnosed a lot of the time. People don't realize that they can get brain injuries without losing consciousness. They can get a brain injury without even hitting their head. Our brain is it's pretty vulnerable, actually, unfortunately. And because it's like this little lump of fat that's floating in liquid surrounded by a hard skull, and it doesn't have a seatbelt. So it's really designed to go as fast as we can run, right? Like 5 or 6 miles per hour is really what our brain is designed for. So we don't even realize that a car accident, even that's like 30 miles per hour, which to us feels really slow, it can cause the brain to hit the inside of the skull and then damage those neurons. So there's just so many things in life. Like I was an avid snowboarder, had no idea how much I was damaging my brain, right? Like I never stopped snowboarding. I just realized that I had to actually treat my brain now, not just, keep letting it deteriorate. Sometimes when we talk about the body, it just feels like we're going in circles, 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 because they're all so interconnected that, every system is playing a role in the others. Okay, so now I wanted to talk about what we can do about it. So I think that, talking a lot about the effects of inflammation, it's important for us to understand. I think it's important for us to know what's going on so that we can know what to do about it and also be motivated to do that, right? I found that, we can be told by our doctor that we're supposed to, eat our vegetables. But if we don't realize why or what those are doing for us, then it's hard to actually do it. So I like to give all the education first, the why behind it. And now I want to go into what we can do about it to actually help the healing process. So as we talked about, the whole premise of this presentation is how can we calm the brain to heal the body? And the first piece of that is really figuring out what's going on behind the scenes. So I'm a huge supporter of brain assessments. I like to actually look at the organ I'm treating. So we do a comprehensive brain assessment where we are looking at the EEG and the quantitative EEG. So that's essentially the electrical activity of the brain. And then we're seeing how that activity compares to others of the same age who are high-functioning, healthy individuals. Okay, so we see where it might be producing too much or too little of the frequencies. Like I was saying about the delta frequencies being deficient, sometimes with mold and Lyme. We might also see excesses of other frequencies, like the ones that are contributing to the fight or flight responses. So we like to look at the EEG, quantitative EEG, and then we like to do the SW Loretta 3D source imaging because this is going to get a lot more specific and targeted. So that's a more advanced technology that allows us to see exactly, okay, the activity is coming from this spot in the brain. So that's what we want to target. Now, of course, we will still look at the whole network with it. That's where we also look at connectivity. We see which brain regions are communicating well, which ones are not communicating, and which ones are over-connected. They're not doing their own job, so they're having to recruit help from others, right? Which is going to really slow down the efficiency of the brain and also fatigue it faster. So we like to look at all those different pieces, specific brain regions, and connectivity patterns. And that helps us determine what the brain needs. And then we also like to just look at the whole body. We do a psychophysiological assessment because we want to see what's going on in the nervous system. Are we in that sympathetic overdrive, right? Is there a balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system? Sometimes we'll even see the parasympathetic can be too high. If parasympathetic goes too high, often that's actually a response to stress. But it's kind of that last-ditch effort freeze response where, it's kind of like the mouse getting caught by the cat. And so it goes into this extreme parasympathetic where it just shuts down. So that's our freeze response. So we like to look at where's the balance there, where can we intervene to help the nervous system. We do look at the overall symptoms people are experiencing, exploring, like you say, Dr. Miles, we like to look at the gut and the hormones and the immune system, see if there's other symptoms, other systems that might be playing a role here, and what all needs to be looked into further. There's functional medicine testing, which, you know, we like to work in conjunction with functional medicine doctors to do some of this testing and really explore what could be going on behind the scenes, what is at the root of that. And then we're also looking at things like nutrition and lifestyle and seeing if there's areas that we could adapt there to really help people start to heal on their own. So next step here, we'll look at the intervention. So I've mentioned a couple things before that we use, but we're mainly focusing here on neurofeedback, neurostimulation. We may incorporate biofeedback, psychotherapy. With that, we tend to focus on things like mindfulness, somatic therapies. So I'll go into each of these pieces, but you can see that we do a more integrative approach because, again, we're trying to treat the whole system, the whole person, to be the most effective. So the neurofeedback, it's basically a type of brain training that uses an advanced technology. It's a brain-computer interface. So it's reading your brain activity in real time and then helping teach your brain how to function in a different way. So it's literally training the brain. We're essentially kind of dangling a carrot saying, okay, come this way. When it does, it gets a little nibble, then we bring it a little farther, and we keep bringing it farther and farther until we get everything within the healthy range of activity. So what we've seen in the research and in our practice is that when we can calm those regions related to stress and pain, then the brain can really enter into that more parasympathetic healing state. We can also improve the functioning of certain parts of the brain that are related to our emotions, as well as regulation of bodily processes. When we're talking about concussions, another region that tends to be really vulnerable is our cerebellum. And that's a part of our brain that is going to regulate a lot of our bodily processes. And if it's impaired, then it's going to allow some of these cycles to get out of balance too. And then, like I mentioned with the brain scans, if we see connectivity issues, we want to improve those connectivity patterns so that we've got that appropriate flow of information in the brain. Everybody's doing their own job that they really specialize in, and they're communicating with one another, but nobody's hogging all the power. And then neurostimulation is a big one that we use with mold and Lyme illness. What we found is that, for example, the microglia tends to be more activated when there isn't enough electrical frequency in the neuron. So when we use neurostimulation, most kinds of neurostimulation are going to increase that electrical frequency. They increase activation in the neurons, which leads to more healthy nerve function and decreases that microglial overactivation. The neurostimulation also tends to improve the overall blood flow, oxygen, nutrients to the brain. So it's kind of like taking all your body's healing processes, healing nutrients, and bringing those to the region that needs it. One of the specific types we like to use is transcranial alternating current stimulation. And this is where we are putting in certain frequencies with a very low level current. So it's very safe. It's nothing like electroconvulsive therapy or something like that. That's basically like a sledgehammer, a wrecking ball. This is more like chisels where we just say, okay, this needs to come a little this way, that needs to come a little that way. So with the alternating current, we can help the brain produce frequencies that are deficient. So like we're talking about with that delta, if we saw a deficiency, we could work on that. But one of the main things we like to do with this one for those struggling with mold and Lyme is we want to use a parasympathetic protocol if we see that excess sympathetic activity or excess stress response in the brain. So when we use the parasympathetic protocol, we're putting in those very slow frequencies and we're helping tip that brain, especially that brain stem, into that more relaxed state, which is going to have those anti-inflammatory effects and again, help the body enter into that healing state. And then, as I briefly mentioned previously, we have an inflammation protocol that has been researched to see the frequencies that help deactivate certain inflammatory cytokines. So this protocol we've already seen can help moderate the IL-1, IL-8, NFK beta, and TNF alpha, or NFKB, sorry. And so those ones are some of the primary that we've seen evidence that it can help moderate. 570 hertz in particular has been shown to moderate IL-6, and we're actually adding that into the protocol now because that's newer research that we found out. So again, as we're inputting these different frequencies, we can put them both into the brain and into the body and help the body reduce some of those chronic inflammatory processes if it's kind of gone awry. So because we also tend to see that generalized slowing, if we saw that in the person's brain, we could use this to help speed up some of those frequencies. This is also something we tend to do with brain injuries and with things like ADHD and other learning disorders. Sometimes there's a slowing that we just need to, nudge it up a little bit. And if we see any of those discharges, then we can use this to help stabilize overall brain activity. So in particular, we've seen that 13 to 15 hertz over the sensory motor cortex can just have this overall calming effect. That's actually one of the treatments used to address seizure disorders. All right, and then pulse electromagnetic frequencies is another one of my favorites. This one is using magnetic fields that actually affect the body on a cellular level. So it opens up the membrane channels, and that is allowing more oxygen and nutrients to enter into the cell. And it also allows wastes and toxins to come out of the cell. So we can essentially get the neurons functioning to then help the overall brain region function properly. This is another one that we can also place on the body. So they have different coils. One of the things we love to do is actually put a couple on the brain, a couple on the body, and then we're enhancing that brain-body communication. So we can address inflammation in both areas simultaneously. And PEMF in the research has actually been shown to also block some of the neuroinflammation that's caused by the microglial cells. So we have seen good evidence for PEMF actually reducing inflammation, reducing those pro-inflammatory cytokines, deactivating microglial cells. And it can also decrease the ROS production, so the oxidative stress. Okay, photobiomodulation. I know this is something that you do, Dr. Miles, as well. This is a really good one. It's a form of light therapy that uses the non-ionizing electromagnetic energy, and it produces these photochemical changes in the cells. And so it allows the mitochondria to essentially absorb the light and converts that into cellular energy called ATP. And this overall process we've found can be helpful for both the gene transcription as well as just repairing and healing our cells. Transcranial direct current stimulation is a great one for helping to calm overactive regions and boost deficient regions. So what this one does is it works with the GABA and glutamate in the brain, and there's an activating and deactivating anode cathode. And if you put the activating one on the region that needs boosted up, the deactivating on the one that needs calmed, then it's helping to essentially draw the energy out of the overactive regions and into the underactive. So for example, with that chronic stress, if we saw that those fight or flight centers were overly fired up, we could actually calm that down with more of a GABA response and then boost up some of these prefrontal regions that are needed for that emotional regulation and more of the higher level cognitive processes. We've also seen in the research that it can decrease inflammatory cytokines as well. So these are all of the cytokines that research has shown so far that TDCS can help with, especially when it's done over the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is basically this part of the brain right here. So it's a regulatory center of our brain. Vagal nerve stimulation is another one that can help to decrease some of these stress processes like CRH and ACTH. Those are ones that play a role in the release of the stress hormones like cortisol. It has also been shown to prevent TBI-induced intestinal permeability. It can reduce inflammatory cytokines, and it can increase the enteric glial activity, so really promote some of those healing processes. So this is one that can be done with the actual stimulation device. So there's actually a VNS device, or we can stimulate the vagal nerve in other ways. So the vagal nerve can be stimulated through things like deep breathing, the diaphragmatic breathing. So when you're breathing into the belly, it actually massages that vagal nerve and creates some of that parasympathetic response. We've seen that things like humming, singing, chanting, that can also stimulate that vagal nerve. So there's other things that you can do on your own to also help improve that vagal nerve function. Also,
I know playing the didgeridoo, gargling are a couple others that people
gargling use.
Yep.
Yeah, there's quite a lot, and that's one that is really easy to Google, all the different things that you can do for your vagal nerve. So. Okay, and then one of the other interventions that we like to incorporate with the neurotherapy is heart rate variability biofeedback, because this is a really good one for interacting with the nervous system itself. So similar to the neurofeedback that's responding in real time to your brain activity, the HRV biofeedback is responding to your heart's activity, and it's helping us find that appropriate balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So it's kind of like we're able to get that bottom up simultaneous with the top down, and they again help each other. HRV biofeedback has also been shown to affect the locus coeruleus. So that's the part of the brain that is playing a role in that stress response, in the release of that norepinephrine. And as we've seen, it can be affected by and contribute to inflammation. So that's an important one. It also tends to balance the HPA axis. As much as we can do to balance that axis, the better. And then it's been shown to deactivate microglia. So there's some good research behind a lot of these things that sometimes just 2 and 2 isn't put together to actually utilize it with populations that are needing these approaches to reduce inflammation. Okay, I particularly love some of the mindfulness and somatic therapies. Without going too much into detail on these, they're really great for helping us to effectively process and express our emotions. With somatic therapies in particular, those are like movement, right? So with our fight or flight response, our body is trying to fight or run, right? It's preparing to do that. And if we just kind of clam up and sit in our chair or force ourselves to stay still, then we're not allowing our body to actually release that. When you watch animals in nature, they do get that stress response, but oftentimes, they're running it off, or they're fighting, or they're even just shaking afterwards to release the fight or flight response. So if we can start to utilize certain movement therapies where we're actually releasing that fight or flight, almost like you're pretending that you're fighting or running. Exercise can be good for that, but also just shaking, stand up, close your office door, shake for 5 minutes. We actually have seen that can have a pretty significant impact on our overall stress levels. So any type of movement can be really helpful. Learning stress regulation techniques and coping skills is helpful. Again, these are great tools to have. The more tools, the better. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that if we only depend on those, but then certain parts of our brain are still out of balance, then we're not going to be as effective in actually utilizing those in the moments you need them. Like you were describing, Dr. Miles, when you've got kind of that straw that breaks the camel's back, we also see that with the stress response, in that if, those fight or flight regions are already fired up and your baseline is up here, and then this is like your tipping point, you don't have a lot of room to actually utilize those coping skills when you get triggered, right? Because you get triggered and it just kind of goes over the top. All of a sudden, all those skills are outside of your awareness or access. But if you do this in conjunction with some of the other approaches like the neurotherapy, where you're addressing those regions directly, you're getting them balanced, solid foundation, then all of a sudden you can actually utilize all of these stress regulation techniques and coping skills, and you can start to not only prevent these excess responses to stress or to pain, but you can also start to move towards that growth and continue to heal on many different levels, including the emotional and spiritual levels. So that's why I love incorporating these. Mindfulness meditation in particular has also been found to improve the functioning of our prefrontal cortex. So again, that's a regulatory part of our brain, really important for the overall functioning and regulation of emotions.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that whole section up. So important. And both meditation and movement and mindfulness practices have been a long time thing that we've found in the clinic to be the people who are doing it have way different results than the people who aren't doing it. But it is cumulative. The people who are doing it, who aren't doing the nutrition, who aren't doing the functional medicine, who aren't looking at other aspects of root causes, still aren't doing so well. But we find a lot of people they've been doing nutrition a long time. They've been taking supplements a long time. They've been doing exercise. But when we add that somatic movement practice, meditation practice, it often puts people in a whole different level of self-awareness. And then all of a sudden, the nutrition becomes that much better because they're more self-aware of their body's responses to it. And everything starts to get better in some cases. So it's not every case, but in a lot of cases, it is a big leverage point for people that people dismiss it and say, oh, well, yeah, I get out and I hike or I take a bath, or they kind of dismiss the more focused practices because they say that they do some things or they don't have time. So it's really important to make time for those kinds of practices. And we find it to make a big difference in a lot of cases.
Definitely. Yeah, I agree. And sometimes it's hard for people to do, if they have that excess stress response, to sit down and close their eyes and focus and actually fully be in their body can be really challenging at first. Now, of course, over time, it does get easier. But I think sometimes that's what pushes people away from it. And if we can kind of get over that barrier and also do all these other things like we're talking about to calm the brain, to help it enter into those more meditative states, and also addressing the physiological pieces through things like the functional medicine that are helping to get to these roots of inflammatory processes that are then contributing to that stress response in the brain and making the body an uncomfortable place. again, if we address it from all the different angles, then these things like the mindfulness get easier, and then you can start to reap the benefits of that in addition. So
Yeah, and I think some people dismiss that, oh, I've tried that, but if they haven't tried these different pieces together, it's like a synergy. It's like a symphony or a composition. They come together and they synergize in a way that the one thing tried at one point in life and another thing tried at another point in life doesn't do the same thing. Just like a perfect storm is taken to bring the body out of balance, it takes a perfect storm to bring the body back into balance. And so it's a lot of little things that add up to cross a threshold in the sense of resilience, to build that resilience in, as you're mentioning. It's really important there.
yeah, for sure. And we also have found that sometimes it is adding all the different pieces, but in a certain order, where somebody might not be ready to just sit down and meditate in the beginning, right? But as we start to get these other things balanced, then we get them to a place where we might even use the neurostimulation simultaneous with the meditation. So we use the neurostimulation to drop their brain down, and then they can tolerate it more. And then the more they get used to that, then they're able to do it on their own without the neurostimulation. So it can be a process, but like you're saying, if we can get in there with whatever areas we can from as many angles as possible, then rather than being stuck in like this downward spiral, it can be the upward spiral, right? Where now each thing contributes to the next, and we just continue to heal. And that's where we often see, you probably see this too, but there's almost an exponential curve with the healing process. In that in the beginning, it can be a little slow going, like you're getting better little by little, but it's not until you hit a certain point that all of a sudden now everything is compounding, and you get this growth curve where now they're really experiencing significant healing.
Yeah. Really, people tend to overestimate how better they'll feel, how quickly, but then they tend to underestimate how better they can feel in the longer term if they stick with treatment. It is this logarithmic kind of a curve. So, if you stick with it, often you get way more results than you thought. But in the beginning, it might be slower than many people naturally think. So I find that too.
I also find that sometimes it can be discouraging, right? When you're not experiencing those benefits right from the get-go. But there's an analogy that I read in the book Atomic Habits, if you're familiar with that. He talks about change, especially positive change, can be kind of like watching an ice cube melt in a 16-degree room. And you go and you turn up the temperature, and it can go from 16 degrees to 17 degrees. And yet, the ice cube still looks the same because you're still below freezing. And then you go to 18, 19, 20 degrees, ice cube still looks the same. But when you get to that certain point where, the temperature has been changing behind the scenes the entire time, things in our body have been changing and healing and starting to put the foundation in place. But then when you finally reach that melting point, then all of a sudden you get to see the benefits. You feel the benefits. So now the ice cube starts to melt, and the more the temperature goes up, the faster and faster that ice cube melts. So
yeah, many ways to put that too. And there's a threshold, and if toxic burden is really high, this is the threshold for chronic inflammation, and it might be coming down, but you're still chronically inflamed. It takes crossing a certain threshold before all of a sudden now global inflammation improves and your symptoms start to feel a lot better. So there are absolutely thresholds in healing you have to reach before you feel like these things start to unravel and disappear.
For sure. You see that in the brain too, where sometimes even certain parts of the brain are more willing to change first, and then others are kind of hanging on. And so you gotta bring these ones down, and then bring these ones down, and this one's still hanging out here. And then ultimately, when it's like, okay, now all these others are in place, they're functioning well, they can start to bring this one into balance too. So
Yeah.
it's a process.
Yeah.
But
Well, functional
okay,
medicine.
so what's that?
Functional medicine here.
Functional medicine. Yeah. So this is where you come in and other functional medicine doctors. Functional medicine is obviously a key piece in all of this. Getting to those roots in the body, not only the mold and the Lyme, but also all of the other pieces. So seeing what's going on in the gut at this point. Are there other imbalances in hormones that could be contributing? So really determining all the roots in the body that could be playing a role in the overall cascade of effects that you're experiencing. So functional medicine, one of the things I love about it is that it's very rooted in science and rooted in data, but then it takes a more natural approach to actually address the problems and really get to the root, as opposed to just, treating the symptoms and just cutting off the top of that weed, right? It's just going to keep growing back. So this is another piece that we always feel is very important. And when we have somebody come to us for mold or Lyme, we usually are wanting them to be working with a functional medicine doctor as well to address some of these other pieces. Now, under functional medicine, one of the things that we also like is neuropeptides. It depends on what you're experiencing. You definitely want to work with a doctor for this. Some peptides you can just order online, but there are certain ones, especially with mold illness, that you want to include and others that you want to avoid. So, but in general, neuropeptides can be really great for helping to reduce inflammation. They can have anxiolytic effects, so reducing anxiety. They can help us grow new neurons and new synaptic connections in the brain. So they can be really powerful. They're just like these little building blocks that help our natural body processes. So that's another area that if you've never explored neuropeptides, it might be worth talking to your doc about.
Yeah, I'm curious if you've seen particular neuropeptides that have been powerful on your observations around the brain changes that you're looking for in your brain assessments. Have there been particular ones that you've noticed significant changes?
Yes. So, it actually depends on the condition that we're addressing. But with things like inflammation, one of my favorites is actually the neuropeptide synapsin, which is kind of a peptide, kind of a supplement. But with the synapsin, it's basically combining the peptides derived from ginseng. So I believe they're called gynosenicides, something like that. This is not my primary area of expertise. But yeah, it's looking at ginsenicides and the nicotinamide riboside. And so that's a building block for NAD. And that combination is really beautiful for having these antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects. And the NAD is also a central metabolic coenzyme. So it's involved in a lot of our cellular energy metabolism, our energy production. So, especially with mold and Lyme, we're usually experiencing low levels of energy. This is a nice one for boosting that energy. We tend to see that people will feel those effects sometimes more immediately, but then it's having those positive effects behind the scenes that are helping to, allow the energy centers of the cells to function more effectively, that mitochondria. It's reducing that inflammation and calming the microglial activity. Again, as I was describing with the inflammation and some of those stress processes, how they can lead to some of that oxidative stress and even DNA damage, this tends to reverse some of that. So it can be really effective for these type of things. Again, you do still want to work with a doctor to see if this is the right fit for you, but that's one of my favorites for people struggling with mold and Lyme.
Great. Yeah, we've seen people have good neurologic responses to that as well in the clinic. So,
oh, great. Yeah. It's still kind of a cutting edge area though. So there's not quite enough research on the exact effects it's having on the brain pre and post. That's an area I want to do some of my own research on. So, okay, I did want to briefly touch on nutrition as well. Some of the things that can be really helpful, of course, you're wanting to reduce inflammatory foods and increase the anti-inflammatory foods. What that looks like for each individual might vary, right? So for one person, something might be inflammatory, whereas for another, it's not. So this is where personalized nutrition comes in, sometimes testing to see what you're sensitive to, especially for things like gluten and the zonulin that can be really inflammatory. So that's a key piece. Omega-3 fatty acids are just amazing on so many levels. They do reduce inflammation. They also help a lot of our brain processes. So that's a key one that is usually recommended, especially when somebody has endured a brain injury. Prebiotics and probiotics, again, like we're talking about, the gut plays a big role in all of it. So we want to help our gut be functioning at its best so that it can help everything else. You want to also consume the foods that are going to help your gut lining heal. You know, if you've had chronic inflammation, then it wouldn't hurt to start doing things to heal your gut lining, regardless of testing that you've done, because it probably is struggling a little bit and could use a little bit of help. Organic foods are really important. I think that sometimes we don't put enough emphasis on this, and it's challenging when they're more expensive and all that, but the toxins that we can consume with non-organic foods can be so harmful in so many ways that the more we can eat organic, the better. If you do have to limit it, just make sure you're really paying attention to which are the foods that contain the highest amounts of pesticides or things like meats that are containing hormones, antibiotics, all of that. Just as organic as you can go, the better. And then reducing things that are more commonly found to increase inflammation. Like I said, the gluten as well as sugar. We love sugar, and sugar in small quantities our bodies can handle, but in large quantities, it can wreak some havoc. Okay, we also want to detoxify. So the first piece of that is reducing your exposure to toxins. Like I mentioned before, we can get toxins through various things like skincare, food, substances. And then there's dietary things and supplementary protocols that you can use to reduce toxins. That's also where you'd work in conjunction with your functional medicine doctor. And sweating is also very good for helping get toxins out of our body. So this is where exercise, infrared saunas, things like that can play a role. Supplements, I've just listed out some of the common supplements that can also be beneficial. Again, this is something that you really want to work with somebody to determine which supplements are specific to you. It's really easy to just get supplements online, and while sometimes they can be really beneficial, you want to make sure that you're getting what your body actually needs and that you're not having any harmful interactions there. But in general, you know, the liposomal glutathione or the S-acetyl glutathione and NAC, those are really beneficial for supporting the blood-brain barrier. The curcumin and resveratrol, as well as the omega-3 fatty acids, are great for helping with the inflammatory cycles. The bisalin, I've never known how to pronounce that, but it's basically the Chinese skull cap. That helps to build GABA in our brain, which is really good for calming those overactive regions. B vitamins, such as folate or B6, B12, those can help to lower homocysteine levels. So that helps support brain health and our overall adrenal balance. High levels of homocysteine have also been linked to inflammation and even shrinkage in our brain. So that's never a good thing. I already mentioned synapsin. That's a good one as well. That's not listed here. So I think that I have a slide on that actually. Yeah. Okay. So that's what we have as far as the interventions. So all in all, I think just the moral of the story is just see what's going on, recognize the interconnections, determine the roots, try to do whatever possible to help reduce that chronic stress, and then using that integrative approach to address that healing from a variety of angles. And I think that with that and with the support of people that can really help you break this down into steps along the way, I think that can really help move you to the next stage of your healing. And that's all I got.
Wonderful. So you can stop the screen share now. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. I think there are lots of intricacies that people are going to be helped to understand some of the connections between, in particular in this talk, the brain together with some of the other things that many of the other talks are talking about, toxins in the environment, gut issues. But you also went into those and covered those yourself as well. So we definitely have a nervous system, brain detoxification system, gut. We have dietary impacts, we have environmental impacts, we have infections in the environment as well. And all of these are going to lead into inflammatory cycles. And then we can intervene in different ways. We can intervene using brain-based technologies that are directly looking at the brain, like biofeedback and neurofeedback. We can look at technologies that are more, or practices that are more targeting the nervous system, like the mindfulness. And then we can look at, of course, nutrition, functional medicine, peptides. So this is a great overarching summary of a lot of the different interventions. And I think some might be new for people. Maybe HRV is a new one, or maybe neurofeedback is new for some people, or maybe vagus nerve stimulation could be new for some people. So it's helpful to have, again, as many tools in the tool belt as possible when we're dealing with especially complex chronic conditions. And I know a lot of our audience who are patients have been going through the ringer with different treatments, and they've tried a lot of things and they need some more ideas. So hoping this will help give them a few more ideas on how to especially help on that neurologic side and brain-based side. And then for practitioners to understand that there are some other things that can be done a little more on the neurologic side, that they potentially, if practitioners are more on the functional medicine side, that they could collaborate and partner with someone doing neurofeedback, biofeedback, HRV, vagal nerve stimulation, some of these therapies that can be really helpful. We need more collaboration and partnership between different practitioners that are having different focuses. So I think it's going to be helpful for the side of people who are struggling themselves, as well as practitioners who are looking to help patients. This has been really great information. So I know people might want to find out more about you. So first, any final words, and then where can people find out about you?
Well, final words, I guess I would just say, don't give up. There is still hope. It can get discouraging sometimes, but just stick with it. There are things that you can do to keep healing. And if you just get the right tools in place and the right people, you really can keep moving forward and help heal from this. So I'm wishing everybody that is seeing this all the best in their healing journey, and all the practitioners all the best in their process of trying to help people on that healing journey. So hopefully this was helpful for just giving some ideas, at least to explore further. And if you want more information, we do have a lot of information on our website, including some of the research around the neurotherapy pieces. So you can find us online at www.neurogrove.com. So that's NeuroGrove.com. And feel free to reach out too if you have any further questions or just want to chat. I'd be happy to chat with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Ashlie Bell. This is Dr. Miles Nichols. Lovely having this conversation. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and have a healthy and a happy day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.